Today we'll be talking about AWS API and workflow services. Right. Today we'll just be looking at how you can build APIs at scale on AWS, and how you can also pair that up with like a workflow service, right? To get the best of both worlds. So what we'll learn, we'll look at a RESTful API. We'll look at how Amazon API Gateway does help achieve that. We'll also look at some things around APIs, around security, and then some monitoring. We'll look at GraphQL, and then how AWS AppSync tries to help you with your GraphQL needs. We'll look at AWS Step Functions, and that's basically going to be the agenda today. Like I said, it's going to be short. So API Gateway, I know I've mentioned API Gateway before. I think I've said it, I've mentioned it in one of the classes we've gone through, but I think we didn't really do anything about it. Like, we didn't practice, right? And I feel API Gateway is so crucial that there's no way we would have gone through this class and you won't even see API Gateway at work, right? So it's not, we should see what API Gateway is all about, right? So what is API Gateway? Fully managed API creation and publishing service. So that's just what it is. It's basically, API in the cloud, right? Serverless API in the cloud. And the beauty is that you don't need to provision anything. Just define your API, right? Even in the traditional setting, there's usually an API, and then when you call that API, something responds, in the backend. But here you can actually manage that at scale, and then you can have so many services respond behind, like whether it's like an HTTP backend, or it's like a Lambda function, or it's like even an AWS service can respond to your API gateway, which makes it really, really powerful. Because if you think about it, we've seen a lot of the services in AWS, right? We've seen them in their different, but again, many of the things we are seeing, most of them come to life when there's a URL, right? There's usually like a URL. It starts from a domain. And in that domain, they're usually going to be like endpoints, right? Endpoints could be /user or /payments, and something behind it is responding. It could be something that is inside AKS. It could be a Lambda function. It could be something that is inside of EC2. The whole idea is that you would pretty much have like a URL, right? And which is where API Gateway comes in, because sometimes you want to have your APIs in a way that you can just manage it easily, number one, and secondly, you can have them just scale, right? Especially when you look at the ecosystem of the services you already have in AWS. The question is that, can you just expose many of these things already just using an endpoint, which is what we're going to see as using API Gateway. So you can create, you can deploy, and you can manage APIs at any scale. It supports REST, HTTP, and WebSocket APIs. It's serverless, so it means if you deploy API Gateway today and you're not using it, you're not going to be charged. And even when you're charged, it's always like after how many requests that you're going to be charged anything significant, which is good, right? So pay-per-use pricing model, and we've seen that with a lot of the serverless models that we've seen, right? You just you deploy them, and if you're not using them, you're not going to be paying anything, right? So the benefits, as always, no infrastructure management. You're not managing any infrastructure. There's built-in security and access control. I think that is ingrained with all the AWS services we've seen. Security is at the core of things, right? Whether it's IAM authentication, whether it's you using Cognito, we've talked about Cognito, right? User pool, identity pool. Whether it's using any of those two, the most important thing is authentication, security, and access control is also there, right? So request, response, transformation, meaning request is different, response is also different, and you can handle them separate. You basically could have like a mapping or transformation that does a transformation that does more on top of your requests and even does more on top of your response too, right? Automatic scaling and high availability. It's serverless. You're not really managing anything, right? It integrates with obviously a lot of the AWS services. You see how we use it for one of the AWS services that we've also treated in the last class. So you see how we can just pretty much reuse that same service, but now with API Gateway easily, right? And then Lambda obviously is like it's like the number one use case for API Gateway from my point of view, because yes, they both of them are serverless, right? So serverless API calling a serverless service, and everything is just serverless. And there's just so much you can build looking at that pattern, right? So what's the core capabilities of API gateway. So request validation and transformation is one of the things you see. You can do response. You can cache your response, right? And I think we've talked about caching at some point, like whether it's when we talked about CloudFront or when you deploy Elastic Cache. Caching is a thing. The fact that if you know something is not changing, why should you always go and fetch it again, right? So even at the API gateway level, you can cache things, right? So that it's faster when you access them the next time. Request throttling, rate limiting, API gateway allows you to do that. So what it means is that you can throttle request. You can also more or less do rate limiting on top of a given request. API versioning and stage management. The whole idea here is that you can have different stage versions, right? So version 1, version 2, and that will help with testing because if version 1 is what is live and you're working on version 2, you don't want it to be released immediately. Sometimes you want to just continue to have V1 in prod, and maybe there's a separate process that tests V2, and then if everything is fine, you promote it to become the live version, right? And then SDK generation for multiple platforms. That's obviously there because at the end of the day, many of these things you can use them using Boto, for example. You can do Boto calls, you can do infra as code. So SDK is obviously a thing when you're dealing with API gateway. And then with most AWS service, there's room for you to monitor them. So Cloud.metrics and login is there. X-ray tracing, you can have X-ray. I think we've discussed X-ray at some point, right? The fact that you can have a trace between your services and see how how it's performing or where the bottleneck is, right? So distributed tracing, you can use X-ray in there to trace to see how API gateway is behaving. You can also have usage plans and API keys and then custom domains, right? So because an API gateway is going to give you a domain, but at the end of the day, you want to tie it to your own domain, so you can do that. And then we've seen ACM, SSL, right? So what it means is that you can have API gateway that is secure, that you can actually put like an SSL certificate in front of it to front load the verification, right, for your APIs. So I have an image there. It's very simple. Basically, you post to API gateway and the post message. We've seen SQS, right? So you can think about it like now more or less like API gateway being the endpoint for you to get to a service, right? Because let me tell you why you will need this. For example, so if you have like an application, right? Let's forget about whether it's a Lambda, whether it's a Docker application or an application that is even running maybe on premise, whatever it is. One of the things that API Gateway can help you do is to standardize those services, right? Because if you see SQS at the end, if your service has to call SQS directly, what it means is that it has to be, use Boto, for example, to push messages to the queue or send messages to the queue. But in this case, what it means is that you can actually standardize that. So instead of them reaching SQS directly, you can put an API gateway in front of everything, right? So that while the implementation behind can change, the API gateway would always stay the same. So it means that the route to do something will never change, but maybe the backend implementation can change, right? So that's one of the flexibility of API gateway specifically in the AWS ecosystem. The thing is that, and you see this as you advance. So for example, if you were dealing with Bedrock, for example, instead of your applications, directly invoking Bedrock, why won't you put an API and say, okay, you want something, you're trying to deal with Bedrock, call this API. And when you call the API behind the scene, instead of calling a Lambda function that is now triggering the service, or it's even directly from API Gateway triggering the service. And you see that a lot in all the patterns that you're going to see in AWS. So API Gateway is very crucial because it's like an entry point to many of the services, whether it's custom or already supported services in AWS, right? So just take note of that. So when you think about RESTful WebSockets and you think about HTTP APIs, what's the difference? REST basically has always been the thing, right? So request response communication model, it's always been there. It's like stateless interactions. So REST basically is what we've always had for your your traditional applications that you have. And it supports get, post, put, delete. I think we've used them slightly, but here we're calling it out specifically as regards API gateway, right? So best for traditional web applications, like I said, it's best for web apps. And then there's also a variant called HTTP APIs, and that's really optimized for serverless workloads, right? It's as you see is specifically optimized for serverless workloads. Lower cost, it's obviously cheaper than REST APIs, and then faster performance with JWT authorization. So JWT is a kind of authorization you can have with API gateway. And then there is WebSocket, right? So if you think about RESTful APIs or HTTP APIs, there's also WebSocket APIs. And the whole idea there is that you can have, here you're talking about bidirectional, right? So you connect to a socket, and then you can send and receive message on that socket, right? So persistent is also bidirectional. Real-time communication, which means it's like you're connecting to a socket, and for the lifetime of that socket, you are continuously receiving and sending communication, right? So it's persistent and it's also bidirectional. Lower latency for infrequent updates, best for chat apps, obviously, because if you see chat, for example, if you notice your chat is real time, right? So it means there's like a socket that is connected to and that can make that communication happen in real time. So gaming or live updates, if you notice all your gaming apps, for example, the game is ongoing, but there's like an app that gives you immediate update. When there's a goal, you see it. When there's a foul, all that is showing up on the app. So WebSocket are the things that empowers that. So what do you really need to know in terms of like API gateway at this stage? So usually stages is one of the things you're going to take note of. So you can actually deploy an API that's in dev, that can have like a dev stage, a test stage, or a prod stage, right? And we're going to see that each stage will have a unique URL where you can test it. That's number one. And obviously they are independent, meaning you can configure dev differently from how you want prod to behave, right? So if the keyword there is like it's a name reference to an API deployment. So the stage ties to a deployment. So when you think about the process, you create API resource and methods, you deploy to stage, which creates it like a snapshot. And that stage, you can pretty much do other things, right? So configure stage variables if you wanted, you can enable caching and throttling, and then you can also monitor with CloudWatch. So from a stage, you go to a deployment. From the API, you create a deployment. From the deployment, you move it to a stage, and then the stage is really what you test, right? So let's go to the console. I think we've said enough. So let's go to the console and then see what this looks like. So I'm just going to type API gateway. So API gateway and see. So what we're going to be doing today is simple. We're just going to, because I don't have a backend app that I want to test. But what we're going to do before, if you remember before now, we used to have like SNS. We'll publish to SNS directly, right? We'll just publish to SNS directly. But in this case, we want to actually use API gateway to be a front loader. So in this case, you send a message to API gateway, and that message that you send to API gateway is going to be published to SNS, right? And we know from SNS, many things can happen, right? You can have a queue that is taking that information. You can have, a Lambda function, taking that information and doing more things, right? So here we're using, instead of the user directly calling SNS, we're using API gateway to offload that direct call and saying call, because when you make requests to an API, it's always the same. Like you call, it's either you're making a post request, get request, or delete request and all that. So that one is standardized, right? But if you have to be calling SNS and all your programming, your code is all filled with direct calls to SNS, what if the implementation changes? Which is why APIs can help you standardize all that. So we don't really care what is behind. I just know if I call an API, I'm going to be able to send message to like an SNS or a backend, right? Okay. So what we're going to do is, as usual, we'll do. Let's create the SNS first. So we'll create the SNS topic. I love SNS. It makes it easy to test many of the patterns that we'll do. So we'll call it. It's going to be standard. So we'll call it my API gateway topic, right? So that's what we're going to call it. My API. I'm just going to call it my API gateway topic, right? As you are aware, you can have an encryption access policy. You can many other things, but that's not why we are having this class, right? So I'm going to go to 10 minutes mail, just so that we can create a subscription, right, to the SNS and see when things are happening. So I'm going to go there. Remember, right, if you create SNS topic and you send things to it and nothing is happening, and there's no subscriber, the message, nobody gets it, right? So you have to create a subscription for you to actually know that the message is going to the SNS topic. So I'm going to go to subscription. and I'm going to create a subscription. In this case, it's my topic, and it's going to be an email subscription. I'm going to paste the email. It's all from 10-minute email. You remember we said we can have subscription filter, meaning I'm not interested in all the messages being sent to the topic, but I'm only interested in a particular type, right? But in this case, that's not what we're showing. So we've created that subscription. It's obviously here. I got an email saying you just got, I'll confirm the subscription. It's confirmed. I'll go back to my subscriptions or go to my topic. Under subscription, I should see subscription has been confirmed. Why are we doing all this? The whole idea is that we want to see actual text to the SNS generate email that we can see on the other side. So with that out of the way, how do we create API? So we can do create API. You can see there is HTTP API, right? So you suppose, Lambda, HTTP backends, low latency, cost effective, right? But there's also REST API, right? You can do REST API. But one thing you'll notice is that you see Lambda, HTTP backend, this is supported. But for REST API, you have AWS services. So in this case, what I want to test is REST API because why? It has AWS services integration. So that's the one I'm going to create. So I'm going to do build. It says new API, clone existing API, import API, example API. I'm just going to say a new one, right? So I'll call it my SNS API, or I'll call it my API gateway because this is not going to be specific to SNS at the end of the day. You can use it for more things, right? So my API gateway. I think this is fine. Let me just do this. I'll say my simple API gateway, right? So this is where it's critical. You can choose private, you can choose edge optimized, or you can choose regional, right? In this case, I'm going to choose regional because I want us to all test it together. Like I want us to be able to test it on this call, right? Private is going to be a different ballgame because then you can only test it internally. But when I say regional, it means I'll get an endpoint immediately that I can test, right? So I will leave it as IPv4 and I'll do create API. So an API is now created, right? So we have an API. If you go stages, we don't have any stage, right? Maybe I'll create a stage. In this case, I'll call it my dev stage, right? I'll call it my dev stage, right? Because we said, yeah, stage is really where you want to more or less, yeah, dev. In the real world, there'll be dev, there'll be staging. In this case, I have my dev stage, right? So I don't really have a deployment. Let me see. I think it's going to need me to create a deployment. So I'll just leave staging for now. So what I'm going to do is that I'll create a resource, right? So here, there is already a resource. Although this home part, it's already like, it's already like, there's already a home part. Maybe we'll just create a method for the home part, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do get. So what it means is that when you get the home part, what do you return? As you can see, I can send it to a Lambda function. I can send it to an HTTP backend. I can send it to an AWS service, a VPC link, a mock. In this case, I'm going to use mock, okay? Because I just want to return something from that. So here, request headers, request string, I can leave all this. This is where you can have like an authorization, right? So now there is none, but you can also have like method request. You can have like authorization in here. But here, I'm just going to do a mock, is a mock response, right? So what it means is that there is like this, you can see when you go to slash the home page and you make a get request, it's just a mock response. And in this case, I'm not really touching anything. So at this point already, what it means is that we have like a resource, right? This one. What we can do is we can deploy the API because now we have one API. We have like one API, right? It's just the home page. And we said, for this case, just mock the response. So I'm going to do stage. I'm going to call it, I'm going to create a new stage and call it dev because that's where I want to test from. And then I'll say my dev, deployment. So I'm just going to do this, right? Deployment description. Remember, I'm doing a deployment now. It's going to push it to a particular stage and I'm naming the stage dev, right? So I'm going to deploy. So what it means is that you can also, here in a particular stage, so we're back to stages. In stages, you can see there's dev. In dev, you have this method that is get, and all that, right? And then if you go to dev, for example, you can actually see your, stage variable is obviously, we can't go through it in this call, but you can see your deployment history. This is the first one that I just did, right? So I have that one already handy. What about, document? There are many other things. You can do Canary at some point, but the most important thing is that we've made our first deployment. So how do we test? There is actually a URL here that says this is the invoke URL. So if I just wanted to call this particular one, if I wanted to call this environment, right, I can call it just using this URL, right? Because in just seconds, we already have a regional endpoints, right? That's why I didn't go the private route. Already this, I can trigger it. So I'm just going to go to Cloud Shell. Like, you know, Cloud Shell is just like a place we can easily just test things, right? So instead of me opening a terminal, I can just go to Cloud Shell and test. So what I'm going to do there is, remember, we just have one, right? Just the home page in this case, and we're mocking the response. So I'm just going to do Cloud Shell. It's going to open, and let's give it some time to open. So we have just this URL, right? For now, we just have one endpoint at this point, and it's a mock endpoint. So Cloud Shell is opening. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to do call -i, and then I'm going to paste this. Missing authentication token 403. Just do here. But if you do these, I have to do more or less like I have to be specific in this case. That's just what I was doing wrong before, right? I think in this case, yeah. So I just have to do this xget blah blah blah, and then do I. So it gives us 200, right? So what it means is that this URL is working. Right now it's a mock response. That's not where we're going to. So where we're actually going to is now to create a different method, right? So this is /home, right? So maybe this one, what I'm going to do is this is the stage, right, for dev. So I'm going to go to my resource, and then I'm going to create a new resource, right? Because right now we have /, but we need more resource. So I'm just going to go here, and I'm going to do resource path. It's not home, but /send message, right? So I'll do send message, and then I'll create the resource. So in this case, remember, we have home that is returning 200. And then we have like a send message that is now a new endpoint. Yes, it's a new endpoint. So in there, I'm going to create a method. And here I'm going to say the method should be post. If it's post here, what am I going to be calling? I'm going to be calling an AWS service, right? But I can call Lambda function, HTTP, mock, VPC link, and then AWS service. In this case, I'm going to say it's US West 2. Let me just check this my 10 minutes email and be sure that this email hasn't, I'm not sure how many more minutes we have. So 6 minutes is fine. It's good enough. So we're just going to go AWS US West 2. In this case, what service? Now look at all these service. What it means is that all these service can be triggered from API gateway. That's just what it means. So all the service that you have here, so can be triggered directly from API gateway, which is powerful, right? But in this case, I'm just going to search for SNS. So I'm going to do simple notification service. I'll leave the AWS domain. In this case, the HTTP method itself, I want it to be a post. So I'm going to call it a post. The action type, use action name, I'm just going to leave it as is. Here, execution role, I will need to create one, okay? Because like you're aware, everything in AWS needs permission to do whatever it needs to do. So in this case, I need to create an API gateway execution role that it will use to be able to do anything with SNS, right? So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to go to here and I'm going to type IAM. So I'm going to do IAM. We'll do this. And then I'll create a role for API gateway. So I'll go to roles. I'll create a role. I'll call it, which service is going to use it? I'm going to give it API gateway. So API gateway. Okay, cool. And then do next, right? When I do next, it gives me this. I'm just going to take it as is. Basically, it's just allows API gateway to push logs to CloudWatch. That's the default that's going to come in. So I'm going to call it API gateway execution role. Okay, I'm going to call it role. So when I have that, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create role. Okay, I'm going to create role. So I'm going to look for it. API, just going to type a gateway. Gateway. So this is the role that we created. Now in here, I'm going to add an additional permission because I know we're dealing with SNS, right? So here I'm just going to do attach policies. Instead of creating an inline one, I'm going to attach. So here I'll do SNS. For this tutorial, I'm just going to use SNS full access, but ideally it depends on what you want to do with SNS. Maybe you have like an endpoint that will do create, update, delete, whatever. But in this case, we're just giving it SNS full access. But in the real, you just have to check. If you check this full access, it's trying to do everything, but maybe that's not all we want, right? Because if you see it has SNS-star, right? But you can actually tune it down to say SNS publish. Maybe that's the action that you want to perform. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give it SNS full access. So I'm going to add this permission. So if you check it now, we have two policies, right? So one is to allow API gateway to push logs to CloudWatch. The other one is to more or less like give it SNS full access, right? So with that, I'm just going to copy this ARN of the execution role, and then I'm going to use that in API gateway. So I'm going to go here. Remember, we're still trying to create a method. So I'm going to do this, right? Or every other thing, I'm going to leave it as is, integration timeouts, blah, 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 all this, I'm going to leave it. So I'm just going to create method. So now if you think about it, right, it's an AWS integration, right? And we did say that it's an SNS integration, right? So, but we did not really specify which SNS topic in this case, right? We didn't really specify. So what we're now going to do is that let's even try and test and see if we just test, okay, first I have to deploy. So this is send message, post, right? So if I have to deploy, I'll just deploy, I have to deploy it. So let's just say added the send message, right? So message endpoint. Sometimes it's good, you know, the changes that are coming to your, you document it with your description, right? So added the send message endpoint. So I'm just going to add that, deploy. An ARN for this integration contains invalid action. Oh, yeah, I think I know why that is happening. So integration request is this action. Yeah, this is where action name, I think I missed it, but we have to have it. So think about it here. We're using API gateway to front request to SNS. So what it means is that if that has to happen, then you need something that says which action am I going to perform against this AWS service, right? So in this case, and this is not, it's something you can find. So if I go to type Boto3, for example, Boto3, and I do SNS, so you know, and I do this, and I go to SNS. Once you need to know, take note is that there are many methods here, but one of it is publish, right? There's also, you know, publish batch, whatever. So the one I'm interested in is the publish to SNS. So I'm just going to take that and go back to the integration and write publish here. So what it means is that I'm doing this as an endpoint to reach SNS, but which method in this case? I'm saying if you do send message, you actually want to post to SNS. So I'll do publish, and then I'm going to save that, right? Let's now test. So let's test again. You know, I have to, no, I think I don't need to deploy to test here, but if I want to really deploy, test the endpoint, then I need to deploy. Here I can actually test directly. So if I test, let's see what are we going to get. So it tells me one thing. It says right now, it's not going to work. And the reason is because it expects a topic ARN. Remember, I said I'm trying to, you know, proxy to an AWS service. But again, in this case, it's SNS. But at least you need to tell me which ARN are you going to call. So in this case, I'm just going to say, so it's saying invalid parameter. Nothing is wrong with the API, but it's saying that invalid parameter. So the next question will be, how do we pass the parameter from here to the, what do you call it, to the SNS topic? So what we can do is that's where you have integration request can happen, right? So what it means is that you can actually go here and you can edit. Integration request is just what happens before the actual message is sent to the integration, which in this case, the integration is SNS, right? So what we can do is that we can go here and we can say, I think it's the request part, no, query string, request headers. Yeah, let's do query string. Okay. So here, let's do query string. So what we're going to do is that we're going to set topic, the topic ARN, right? That we got just now. So we're going to do this topic ARN, and then you can actually reference method, the method that was being called, the request. You can get things from it. So if I do info, for example, it will tell you the things that you can use. So method or request or path, method or request dot, you know, you can get things from the method itself. But in this case, I actually want to pass in an SNS, like an SNS path. So I want to actually send in my direct topic. So my direct topic ARN is this one. So I'm just going to go there and paste it here. So I'm going to paste it. Did it actually get that? Yeah, it's there. So I'm just going to save. All right. So I've saved it, and then I'll test again and test. So I'm just going to do test and see if we get that error. So now that topic ARN is gone. Right now, we are not seeing that again. So it means here, we're sending the topic ARN now in this case. Remember, we are manipulating the request. In this case, what the user is sending is probably different. But in between, we here are piping it to say, we're sending this message to this specific SNS topic. So that's exactly what I do. But now you can notice that the message is gone, right? But now that brings us to another thing, because now it's expecting that there should be a message, right? It's expecting that there should be a message at least that you're sending, right? Because that's what it's saying. Message, one validation error, value null at message failed, right? So what we're now going to do is that we're going to take message. So we're going back there again. So the integration request, the request that you're sending to the integration, when you're sending it, please not just send topic ARN, also send a message. So in this case, I'm going to say, where am I now? I'm going to go to query this, add more, add another one. And here I'm going to do message, message, right? And then here is where I'm going to post method.request.body. Now, if you check info, you see all the methods here. You can have more method.request, method.request.header, if you were getting the message from the header, right? In this case, I'll be taking whatever is sent in the body, and then I'm going to save. Also, in case you want to integrate this to other AWS services, this is, if you go to publish, for example, look at the parameters that it expects. It expects a topic ARN. It also expects a message, right? So you won't. So whenever you're integrating API gateway to an AWS service, you just need to know what that AWS service parameters are, right? So in this case, topic ARN and then message. So with that out of the way, let's go and test again. So we'll go here and then we're going to test. So that is sorted. We're just now going to test again. So test, I'm not sending any message. But in this case, it looks like it just worked, right? It means it didn't show any error. So that means it actually went, right? It actually went. How will you know? If we go to 10-minute email, you see that there's something here that just came. This is 11:43. So this just came. But you see it's empty, meaning it's working, but we just weren't sending anything. So how do we propagate something to it? So I can actually go back to where I'm testing, and then I can say hello. I can just send a string and say hello from API API gateway. We'll do this, and then we're going to send again, right? So we're just going to test again. The good thing is that you can test your API while developing it. You don't need to deploy first to test. So I'm just going to test. It did say this is good, so it means there's no issue. And then if you see it here, let's see, there's a new one here. So this is hello from API gateway, right? The message is now coming in. This is us testing directly from the API gateway. But that's not how you want to test, because ideally you want to send that URL either through your domain or through your application, right? And then people can test from the outside. Remember, in this case, we're using SNS, but this backend can be any of those options that we saw: Lambda, HTTP backend, SNS, AWS service, so many things that you can do, right? So what I'm going to do is that we already have an endpoint now. Why not we test it directly, right? So we have an endpoint, but for that to happen, it means we need to deploy this. We can test directly, but for it to actually happen, we have to deploy. So we'll deploy the API to our dev stage. We'll say, okay, we're done developing this particular API. So finish the send message API, right? So we're done. So we'll just deploy. So now it means that once it's live, you can't actually just directly send message, right? We know all the resource we have. There is like a send message and it's a post method, right? So what we can do is that we can go here, call. We'll just do, I have like a handy command that I already have here. I'm just going to post, but this is standard stuff, right? The first one we did X get. Here I'm doing X post, right? I'm trying to post to that endpoint. The content type is application JSON, and then I'm just passing it a body. I'm saying message is sent from call, right? So because we're testing it from the command line. So in the API, we just now need to go back, fetch the base URL. We'll paste it here, and then we'll do slash. Remember that thing is send message, right? Message is the name. I think it's correct. Yeah, I think it worked because we didn't get any error. But how do we confirm? We'll just go here and see if there is like a new message that came in. I hope this hasn't expired. We still have 4 minutes, so it's fine. We'll just do this. Let's see. Did it actually even work? Let me see if it has finished deploying. Okay, I'm going to copy this, take it out. Dev. and then I'm going to do slash. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm doing X posts, but I want to see the information that comes out from it. Blah blah blah. Message. This is okay. Something is wrong. Yeah. Okay. Something is actually wrong. So this is the correct command. This one. So if you notice, I think it was complaining that the curly brace is there. So because there's double quote inside, you have to quote whatever is outside, right? So I'm quoting single quote inside. I'm using double quote, and then I'm going to try again. Sorry, let me just do. I can't even do both at the same time, but let me do X post. Let me just move this over. I'm just going to clear my screen, post this command. Now it's saying I'm missing authentication token. In this case, let's see. At least we know the API is working, so that's not a big deal. We know at least it's working. It says I'm missing authentication token. Let me see. Let me see if the API has been deployed. Let's go to resource. This one. Let's see. No, let's go to the stages. Let's go to dev. Let's go to this one. No, dev. Deployment history. Finish the send message API. So the deployment is fine. For this one, let's go to the resource. Send message. Posts. Authorization is none. Let's see. Method requests. Let me just be sure that we don't have anything configured that could be blocking things. The request itself is there. And this guy has the right role to reach SNS, so it shouldn't be a problem. Integration response is fine. We're not really doing anything. And then the response headers are fine. Testing is working. So when we do this, at least this works, right? So we're seeing the results. It shows up here. So we just now need to call that URL. Let me just be sure that we actually have the right URL. So it's dev, it's /dev. I think it's /dev/send message, right? Let me just look for the resource. The name itself is this. Is send message. This is the part. And then we're doing blah, blah, blah. And then doing this. Let's see. Yeah, I suspect that time maybe the deployment hasn't finished. Maybe that's why, because I didn't do anything separate. So it looks like it looks like the deployment hasn't finished then. I think that's just basically happened. But you can see when I tried it again, it worked, right? I didn't have to change anything. But you can see this is the same response that we're getting from here. So if you see when we tested it in the UI, this is exactly the response we got. But now we're getting it from here, right? So just to confirm, if we go back to our subscription, you'll see we got two messages, right? So there's this one that says a message sent from Carl. This one is also message sent from Carl because we tried it again. But if we actually go back and say confirmed or whatever, it's working. So the whole idea is that now you're using API gateway here, right, to front your interaction with SNS. And there are many places. In fact, I know exactly how these can work because think about it. One pattern where this can work is that if you think about your GitHub, like your GitHub, if you were using GitHub and you wanted to use code pipeline, for example, as your orchestration or your like code, your more or less like your CI/CD tool. The whole idea is that you can actually send this to GitHub, or for example, your URL to GitHub. But whenever that message comes in the form of like commit was happening, the pull request was open, it can actually trigger your webhook and push that message to SNS. And from SNS, you know what happens. When it's in SNS, anything can happen. You can from there trigger a Lambda function that triggers a code pipeline, or you can do so many things in as much as either like a Lambda function is involved, or like any other service that is in AWS. But the point is that instead of the end user calling SNS directly, we've used API gateway to front that request, right? And that's exactly what is happening here. I think that is it. And you can see it shows exactly the message ID, the response metadata. And why we're actually seeing it on this other end is just the fact that you can see this is sent from curl, confirmed. The reason why we're seeing it here is because we have a subscription to it, right? If we didn't have a subscription, you won't see the message here. So I think that's done. So what we are just going to go, because now anyone from the internet can actually call that URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of. Remember, it's serverless. If not that I'm sharing it on live call and anyone can call that, make requests to that URL, I can leave it because in as much as I'm not using it, I'm not going to pay. It's all serverless. But now because I'm using it, because I'm doing it live, I'm just going to delete it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to my APIs and this one, and it's as simple as deleting. So I'm just going to go confirm. It's going to get rid of every other thing. So it's gone. If I go back to, there's even no API again. But there's more you can do, right? You can actually have API gateway, use your VPC link. That's like a different conversation entirely. You can have custom domains. Remember all the tests that I was doing in Cloud Shell, I'm using API gateway domain. But if I have a domain name, I can replace this. This becomes brainyl.com/dev, or I can even mask this entire URL such that when you call brainyl.com/send message, you're just going to send message to my SNS topic, right? Cool, that is done. So we are done with the SNS part. So let's go back to the slide. So if you look at it, we did talk about the stages, the deployments, so we didn't really go in depth, but remember API gateway needed permission to talk to SNS. That was set up, right? But I was calling API gateway directly. You could set up more or less like policies to decide who can execute your API gateway. That's number one. You can also set up who can do anything, do any action with your SNS, right? You can also have custom authorizers in the form of Lambda function. We didn't use API keys. Honestly, there's more to API gateway, right? This is just like an introduction to tell you some of the things that you can quickly just do there, right? So you can use resource-based policies, JWT token validation. There's just so many things you can do. You can also do cross-origin resource sharing, right? They call it cross. The whole idea is that you can do it in such a way that if it's not within your domain, the domains that you own, the request should not go through. So only receive requests if these domains are mine, okay? So there is more. What I just showed you is basically a quick way just to get an API running, right? Just imagine I was trying to test something in AWS. I didn't have to set up any custom, I didn't have to do anything long. I just created an API, created a method, created a resource, created a stage, and immediately from the internet, I could test my API and I could send message to SNS. From that SNS, I already have a subscriber in the form of an email that was already getting the email. So immediately I've been able to deliver value without like doing so much, right? And that's the power of the cloud. That's the power of serverless. And this you see in a lot of patterns, even in a lot of production workflows. So don't think I'm teaching it and you don't need it. You need it. It's some of the things you'll be seeing in the real world. Okay. So with that done, let's now look at AppSync. So we've looked at API gateway. API gateway is one way to send to create URLs. But there are many reasons why you want to say, I don't want to use API gateway. Maybe I want to use AppSync. And this is going to be familiar for people who know GraphQL, right? So GraphQL is pretty much another way you can have your endpoints basically, but it has its own benefits and there's many things that makes it different completely from the usual API gateway that we saw. Because in API gateway, for example, you needed specific routes, right? So you needed more or less like endpoints. If I wanted to do send message, I'll create a post. And sometimes if I needed like a get users, I'll create requests, and that's what GraphQL is trying to solve basically. It was obviously pioneered by Facebook, but it has grown now to be something that is widely adopted by a lot of companies, right? So real-time data synchronization is one of the things you see. Offline data access capabilities, built-in security and caching. So everything, all the good things we also saw in API Gateway, you can have them in AppSync also, but just know that it's managed GraphQL. So like we've seen, API Gateway is native to AWS. But if you already have GraphQL and you wanted to move to AWS and you're saying, how will I host it? Yeah, you can use AppSync inside of AWS. One of the key features, obviously this class, we can't talk in depth about GraphQL, right? Because GraphQL solves a lot of things. The fact that you can actually, for example, if there's like an endpoint, you can choose exactly the data that you need from there, right? From that endpoint, you can do all that. So what it means is that you can do single endpoint for multiple data sources, right? So what it means is that one endpoint, but you can actually use it to fetch multiple data sources. It shines when you do real-time subscription, right? And you have a lot of integration with DynamoDB, Lambda, RDS. You can use them. You can have resolvers that uses Lambda or uses DynamoDB or RDS to fetch data and return back to the end user. It's well. It's one of the advantages there is really for mobile apps, because mobile apps are very sensitive. Sometimes you don't need to flood them with a lot of data. Sometimes they just need more or less like they just need to be able to query exactly what they need, right? So that you can keep the response small, right? So if you look at the fundamentals of GraphQL itself, query language for APIs. So GraphQL itself is a standard, right? So it's a standard that you can basically use to. It doesn't really speak to the implementation at the back end, right? You still have to have all your resolvers and the exact place where the data is coming from, but you can actually use it to also build your APIs, right? So single endpoint for all your data operation. Client will specify exactly what they want to fetch. So you can have an endpoint that returns 1,000 properties, and maybe there's a particular endpoint and there's a particular client that only needs 2. There's another client that might need 10, right? So you can read more about GraphQL. This is not really about the GraphQL class, but it's just the fact that you can have GraphQL inside of AWS using AppSync, right? So strongly typed schema is one of the things you see. So when you think about GraphQL versus REST, what's the difference? GraphQL, single request, flexible. You can have single request, flexible queries. But in REST, like we've seen, you saw I created multiple endpoints, right? I created the home page, I created the send message. I would obviously create some other methods, and then create exactly what they are going to be returning. So sometimes there's too many endpoints, and then each endpoint is also returning too many things that the client cannot choose which they want, right? So, and again, fixed response, right? If an endpoint is saying I'm returning 10 things, it always returns 10 things. There's no way to adjust that, but GraphQL solves all that. So reduced overfetching is one of the benefits, one of the major benefits why you use GraphQL. You only fetch what you need, right? Better for mobile performance. Like you see, mobile phones are very sensitive. They're small devices that, learning curve, obviously, you need more time to learn it. That's one of the trade-off. There's learning curve, and then caching, like API Gateway does caching on its own, but for GraphQL, for AppSync, you need to do some added caching for you to, really reap the benefit at scale, right? So if you look at it, if you look at the architecture, it's very simple, right? So you create like a schema. You create a schema, and then in that schema, you have like resolvers. Your resolvers are basically what goes to your data sources, right? The data sources, like on the right, could be from Amazon DB, DynamoDB. It could also be from API Gateway. Could also be from Lambda. It could also be from Aurora. So it's very, very nice. So when you see the data sources, you can have DynamoDB, Lambda, RDS, HTTP. Resolvers, obviously, you are mapping the operations. So if you already know GraphQL, and that's what I keep saying when you are making your journey to the cloud. For many of the cases, infra, you're going to be supporting the infrastructure. So you probably are not, but again, it's good you have an idea of, at least you probably just need to understand GraphQL, right, before understanding AppSync. Many of these things, like I've always said, they existed prior to the cloud, right? The cloud is just helping you the cloud is making it easy for you to manage. That's the difference. So real-time data updates, you can see. So when you think about the data flow, the client will send GraphQL query or mutation query is also a different subject, right? Query when you're reading, mutating when you're mutating data, right? All that is all native to GraphQL. So it's not something we can extend. We can talk that much in this class. Then AppSync will validate that schema, then the resolvers themselves, which is what is in the middle, will execute that against a data source that you've already defined. And the response is returned to clients. And then you can also do subscriptions, right? Well, subscriptions is obviously powered by GraphQL itself, but AppSync, you can do it with AppSync in AWS. Step function is something I also want us to see in this call. This one will be easy to show. So we've seen most times you find out that sometimes we've done things on their own, but in the real world, sometimes you want orchestration. So whenever you hear orchestration, workflow, that's where you should be thinking about step function. And there's many reasons you want to do it, right? But sometimes maybe there are multiple steps that you need to coordinate. You need to coordinate them, and in those multiple steps, you can be using multiple AWS services. Maybe you are sending SNS. Maybe you are calling a Lambda function. Maybe you are sending message to Slack for someone to respond. There is many things that can happen, right? So if you have to be doing it manually, it's going to be hard, and that's where you can use like like a step function to orchestrate that workflow, right? So coordinate, the key word is really you can coordinate multiple AWS services, right? So every of the services that we've talked about, in as much as there's an API to call it, step function will do that job for you. Built-in error handling and retry logic that is there all built in, right? So if you think about the key features, state machine based workflows, that's really what it is. It's unique to AWS. This is not like a service that is outside of AWS. This is AWS owned, right? JSON based workflow definition is what you see. It has integration with all the many of the AWS services that are out there, right? Parallel execution, meaning you can run some things in parallel. You can also do branching, meaning if this condition is true, go left. If this condition is true, go right. Step functions are really powerful, right? And then you can even have human approval workflows. The whole idea is that you see how SNS can send messages, right? Or you can also send message to Slack. Maybe there is like a process, very long process that has to happen. Someone at some point needs to click on an approval for the step function to continue, right? So you can stop and then send an approval message to someone, and then once they approve it, the process will continue, right? You can do all that with step function. So if you look at it on the right, that's exactly what it looks like. This example we are going to take a look at. But the whole idea is that there's a task, right? A task is really the first one there that says add pet to stop. That's a task. In this case, it is invoking API gateway. Usually, sometimes there's like a choice state. So once you pass a task, maybe you can have a choice state to say, is it true or false? If it's true, do this. If it's false, do this, right? There's also like parallel execution, meaning you can have a step that moves to like, you can have a step that is executed in parallel, maybe 10 things happening at once. And then you can have a wait. A wait will just delay for a specific time and then continue after a while. And then you can pass actions that actually pass. And there's also fail and succeed step. Like if you see, for example, there's a failure step on the right. There is also another step on the left. So when you see the failure state, failure on the left and on the right, you can still see there's an action there that says retrieve pet stop, right? Which is more or less like a task. So input and output processing, because you take input from from a previous step, and then you perform an action, and then you send it downwards, right? So and you can continue to bubble the input or the output down, right, to the downstream services, and then until you get your final response, right? And then there's error handling. You can have retries on the step function itself. It's like huge, but we're just going to scratch the surface. So if you think about it, we've seen SQS. We've done SQS on this call. If you want to compare it with step function, they're basically two different things, right? SQL will only hold the queue for you. Something is going to process it and take it out of it. But step function, complex workflow, you're orchestrating it. There's like a visual designer that you can see to see how exactly everything are moving, right? State management, coordination is doing all that. So whenever you think about multiple step business process, that's when you should use step function, right? And then whenever you're thinking of human approval process, step function is something you should consider. Conditional workflow logic is something you should also, that's when you should also consider step function, right? And then complex error handling. But you've seen with SQS, all that is not there. It's basically, okay, you try it. If it fails, you put it in a dead letter queue. You can reprocess it again, but that coordination is missing, right? Which is what step function brings in. So this is just some serverless pattern. This is also like a state machine in here, right? But it explains everything that I've already said. You can have buy or sell, go left or go like, depending on what you want to do, right? So if you look at that, let's go into the console and see what it looks like. So we'll just go to the console and we'll do step function. We'll do step function. So we'll do step functions. We'll go to step functions, and then under step functions, we'll get started, right? So in this case, I'm going to choose a template. And this is what I thought I could do with the AppSync quickly. I'm just going to do, there's an hello world example, but there's also like a choose template, and there's like create your own, but I'm going to choose a template. And there's a simple template that I want to choose because we've already done with API Gateway. And honestly, these templates are here as like an inspiration. So if you ever want to think, there's one that is doing batch job, there is one that is doing pre-processing, machine learning, data model. So step functions become very, handy when you are dealing with, data manipulation in an orchestrated manner, right? But in this case, I'm going to use a very simple one that says make a call to API Gateway. So I'm just going to do next. I'm going to run it as a demo. I'm not building on it, but this is exactly what it's going to do. So there's a start step. It's going to go invoke a step that is going to invoke an API gateway, and then depending on what comes in, that will give us a state that is either a failure or it's going to retrieve. And once it has retrieved the result from API gateway, it's going to end the step function, right? So I'm going to use this template. I'm going to use it. And the thing is that it's here, and this is graphically, and that's why I say there's the graphical illustration. But you can also see the code. So if you like code, to write code, it's here. It's here basically to use an IAM role, blah, blah, blah. It will tell you, this is where it's going to start. You can see start at. It's something you need to pay attention to, right? So let me zoom in a bit. You see, this is where it decides where it's going to start. And it's going to start here. And then there's next, and then there is like an output. So the next is pet was added successfully. But again, if you go to pet was added successfully, it's a choice state. Choice state means these are the choices, but this is the default. So the choice is saying if the condition is this, go to failure, right? Else default to this, right? So this is exactly the diagram that we've seen. So if you write this correctly and you validate it, you're going to see a diagram, a beautiful diagram that's going to tell you how the orchestration is going to work. In this case, I'm going to deploy and run. So in case you are doing this in your account, what you just need to take note of is CloudFormation. I'm happy we've talked about CloudFormation. So you see everything is beginning to add up, right? So if you see, this is going to create a CloudFormation stack, basically, that's going to deploy everything, because that's a good way, because it can just deploy it and also take it out immediately when we are done. So if you check the resources, it's probably creating all the things that we created manually, which is why I love that we're doing this now, because you can see it's creating a deployment, it's creating a REST API. REST API was exactly what we just did, right? It's creating an IAM role. If you refresh it, you see a number of resources it's creating. It did create all this, and then creation is complete, right? And then it created a state machine also. And then there's a role, there's a REST API, there's a deployment. All the things we saw around API gateway. It needs that to do exactly what it wants to do. So what you should take note now is that I deleted the last API gateway I created, but if we go back, you will notice that another API gateway has been created, right? But the good thing is that now you should have the understanding to relate with it, because this is the gateway that was created. This is the one that was created. There's just like two methods: post, pets, get, and then there's like a post, right? So let's go and check the step mention. It said it has been created already. So what it means is that it even give us like a test event to trigger the step function. In this case, I'm going to start execution. And the good thing about it is that you can actually go to here. You see the definition, right? But you can actually see you can also see the execution input and output. So if you go here, you can actually see this is the input, this is the output that was returned, right? And if you scroll down, for example, you can actually see, if I scroll this to the side, you can actually look at each step to see exactly what was done. So here, you can see what was supplied. This is the input. This is the input. This is the output that was returned. And then because for that reason, it went to choice state, it was not an error. It did not fail. Rather, it went to the retrieve step. And in the retrieve step, you can see this was the input that was sent to it, which was exact output from the previous step, right? And then this was returned, right? But all these were directly calling API gateway. So it means that you can actually have a workflow that is coordinated, that calls your services. It could be invoking a Lambda function. It could be sending something to SNS. It could be calling a queue. There are many things that you can do, right? So that's step function in a nutshell. There is absolutely so many complex things that you can do with AWS step function. So many things, step functions. And honestly, with the world that we are right now, these things are easy to write. You just need to know it exists, and you need to know the things that you can integrate it with. And that's really the most important thing that you need to know, and many of the areas that you can apply it. But with this, you can actually build a lot of workflows in AWS that can do very things that you can't just do in one go. You can actually have multiple steps that get it done, right? Cool. I always say when we start, it's going to be short, but this ended up being long. So when you think about it, yeah, you can have sequential processing, step 1, step 2, step 3. You can have parallel processing, things happening in parallel. You can have branching. We've seen that. You can have human approval, sent to SNS, approve it using that workflow. And then you can do error handling also, right? So something like what is on the right. If you think about the best practice that we need to pay attention to, yeah, obviously this is just me talking, but again, you will obviously, the people that I'm talking to, that I'm targeting here, are really not people who are going to be building the APIs, right? You are probably going to the developers want an API, and you give them API gateway and set it up correctly, making sure security is followed, best practices followed. But again, they would obviously follow it to define, RESTful conventions, follow RESTful conventions. Implement proper error handling is something that will be worth doing, because at some point you also be collecting logs from API gateway. You'll be logging those things. You'll be using it for your monitoring. You'll be using it for your troubleshooting, right? Status code, obviously, for our own side, the APIs need to be versioned, right? Because you need to promote. Sometimes it's dev, or V1 or V2. Maybe V1 is what is in prod. At some point, you need to change it, and you have to have a process to do that and not cause disruption, right? So we didn't really look at the authentication, but there are many authentication modules that are out, that are in there, whether it's for whether it's for AppSync or for API gateway, right? So authentication, authorization, HTTPS for all communication, that is like very, very important. We didn't really talk about like where you can add, but you can actually, make sure that your API gateway is using the right, the right endpoint. And then you can do rate limiting, throttling, just to make sure your APIs are protected. No one is just sending. And you can obviously put a firewall in front of it, right? And then you can also validate the input data. There's like ways for you to actually validate to be sure that what is expected is what you want, right? What other best practices are there? You can do caching whenever appropriate. You can use connection pooling. You can obviously implement like circuit breaker patterns. And then you can monitor latency and error. So we didn't really check that, but if you go to the API itself, you will see there's a CloudWatch metrics that you can see to see how long it is taking for the backend to respond. How many 4xs errors do you have? 5xs error, like all the errors, the things that are working well and the things that are not working well. Those things are not there for show. They are there for you to see, have an idea of like how long is your API taking to respond, right? And then workflow design, keep state machine simple and focused, basically focused on the job. Error handling is one thing you need to ensure when you're designing step functions, because sometimes you need to make sure that you can actually catch error and do the right thing, right? So that an error is not just going to stop the entire process. If it's an error that you can handle and progress, you should be able to do that. And then, whenever possible, parallel execution. There are some steps that need to go in parallel. You don't need to cascade them. You can just do it in parallel, right? And then design for idempotency, right? The whole idea is that, you can retry that same step again and make sure that you still get the right result that you're looking for. Okay, so yeah, we did look at many things in this class, right? It's supposed to be short, but it ended up being long. So RESTful API gateway, some of the security around it, GraphQL, AppSync, these three services are very crucial. They're crucial when you think about the grand scheme of things. When you're dealing with workflows or you're dealing with serverless application, you probably need an API to expose your endpoint. AppSync can do that for you depending on if you go that route. API Gateway can also do that for you. And then you can obviously use Step Function to coordinate those many workflows, right? Yeah, that's a summary. It's a long it's a long class. So that brings us to the end of this particular class.